but I think it would be good to get started. I want to welcome everybody back to our virtual workshop, Complete Streets for Complete Communities. I am Emily Schwiniger, Deputy Director of Thriving Communities with Smart Growth America, and we are working in partnership with Sustain Charlotte and Rayo Community Health as part of CDC's Active People Healthy Nation initiative. Just a reminder of where we're coming from, and we are here. This is module 3 for partnerships and implementations. Very excited. I'll introduce our first speaker in just a minute. But before we get started, just a reminder, housekeeping, please keep yourself on mute if you're not speaking. Remember to use the chat box. It's a great place for us to keep the conversation going, even while someone is speaking or there is a presentation rolling. We'll be monitoring that closely, and we will make sure that we are calling out any important questions, etc. And I see that we have Scott Curry on, and we're very excited to have a few people from Charlotte's DOT, including Angela Berry and Scott Curry, so welcome. That's great. It's great to have everybody joining us. Just a reminder about some of the things we discussed last week. We started off the week last week with the benefits of complete streets. And we talked about how to communicate those benefits and how to make those benefits accessible to vulnerable communities. If you remember, I presented, and also my colleague Cole Zaccaro. We talked also about understanding the role of land use and creating activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations, and understand the pathways for reviewing and revising existing plans, policies, and procedures. And then last Thursday, we had Chris Zimmerman and Beth Osborne, both from Smart Growth America, speaking with us on designing for active transportation and land use. Beth spoke to us about how to design for active transportation, considering speed and safety and connectivity, looking at car-centric versus complete streets approach to transportation, and thinking of how we have traditionally designed for free flow of cars and how we're shifting that approach in cities across the country. And Chris Zimmerman took us through a bit of the history of how we got here, looking at the history around land use choices, transportation investments like the interstate highway system, and looking at racist housing policies and how that has impacted equity today. Also looking at transitioning a car-oriented corridor into a walkable place. He took us through an example from Arlington, Virginia, called Columbia Pike, where he actually worked as a local leader on developing that area, reconfiguring the area. If you remember, it was, just a big, large road, backset shopping center with parking in front. And what we saw towards the end was, a really reinvented, walkable, people-centric place. So that's just a quick reminder of where we have been. And now let's head towards where we're going. Again, we're excited to have Christopher Coase with us today. He is Vice President of Land Use and Development at Smart Growth America, and also the Director of LOCUS, the Responsible Real Estate Developers and Investors. We're really excited to have him here with us to talk about equitable development, and I will hand it right over to him. We've got a great presentation, conversation, and remember, please, this is a learning exchange, so we want to hear from you all as we're going through these topics. We want to know how this is relevant to Charlotte, and we want to have that conversation. So with that, Christopher.
Thank you, Emily. Just for confirmation, is the screen visible and the sound check? Good.
Yes and yes.
Awesome. Well, again, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited. My mom always requires that I put a picture, one of her favorite pictures up. So if you see my mom anytime soon, just know that I'm following her directions. But as Emily pointed out, I currently serve as Vice President of Land Use and Development at Smart Growth America, as well as Executive Director of a national coalition of LOCUS, which I'll speak to in a second. But before I start this presentation, I think it's important for me to just center, because oftentimes we get caught up in titles and backgrounds and things of that nature. One of the things you should know about me is that I come from a very small town, literally 25, 30 minutes north of Tallahassee, a town called Thomasville, Georgia. So one, I recognize that you're all in North Carolina, and there's always competition between the Falcons and the Panthers. So I will do not hold that against me. But more importantly, why I do my work, why am I in this space, I really care about my hometown. The idea that places have a determinant on your health, a determinant on your social well-being. And in many ways, my life has been wrapped around how can I ensure people like me, people who come from my communities, can actually have success, and that could be true for my children, their children's children. So, one of this conversation, I just want you to know that that's how I see my work and why I'm doing this. And so with that, as was stated before, I currently serve as executive director of what I consider some of the best minds in the real estate space, both from the investor community, the developer, and the practitioners who are really trying to create those livable places that I remember living up in Thomasville, where you can smell the bakery, where you can walk to your grandmother's safely, where it's easy access, safe routes to school, the idea that you can bike everywhere in the town, while also recognizing that, and much like the city of Charlotte, my town experienced a whole change of land patterns where historically we had a beautiful bones, a historic district, but then fast forward after World War II, which you probably heard during Chris Zimmerman's statement, where we started adopting a lot of car-oriented development. And what I'm really fascinated and really excited about in my work at Smart Group America, not only just working with folks like Emily, but working with the private sector to figure out how to undo some of those challenges and some of those land patterns, and how do we create more healthy places? How do we create places where there's a reduction in pedestrian fatality? And one of the things we do as locals, we work closely with individuals at the local level, at the state level, as well as the federal level, to change public policy to make it easier for us to create these vibrant, walkable places, but do it in such a way that actually recognize reality. And so with that, one of the things I want to do, in addition to provide some insights about some of the things that Emily pointed out earlier, is to do some level setting. So when someone says, Christopher, you're going to use the term, equitable development, walkable urban development, what the heck are you talking about? What do you mean? Well, just so you're aware, the way we define it at Smart Group America, and sorry, there's a slight delay. Sorry. We start from this premise of recognizing the difference between equity and equality, that you can't talk about inclusive communities, you can't talk about healthy communities unless you recognize how we got here. And this is always a great illustration of the fact that the built environment in and of itself has systematic, institutional, racist, classist policies that we are now, both in the private sector, local advocates, as those also who are in the public sphere, are trying to undo. So if you had to give it a definition, essentially when we talk about walkable urban places, it's basically places that are compact, mixed-use development with affordable transportation options that has easy access to jobs, neighborhoods serving stores and amenities that not only support the market rate housing or those who are higher income, but also take into consideration those who are middle and low and moderate income for a variety of cultures. And at Smart Group America, we believe that no matter who you are, no matter where you live, you should live in places that are healthy, prosperous, and resilient. And so again, from a level setting, this is when you hear me talk about equitable development, it's within this context. So one of the first questions, as part of this discussion, we're going to focus a bit around how to achieve equitable development. Now, here you see West Boulevard. It's for us to kind of focus in, but this conversation could be applicable to the entire city and the neighborhoods of Charlotte. But one of the first things we want to talk about today, here, when our team took a look just at this specific neighborhood, the West Boulevard neighborhood, here's what we knew, what we found. It's a predominantly African-American Black community, median income, $25,000. It's approximately $36,000 less than the county average. When you look at housing and transportation costs, on average, 38% of the households that are there are spending 38% of their income on housing and transportation. you have a significant amount of individuals in this particular neighborhood. Again, we're just taking a snapshot, who are what we consider housing cost burden. You have a significant, I would call it significant 14% poverty rate in this neighborhood. One reason why I'm bringing this up is that when we talk about equitable development, you can't talk about it in a silo. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. A lot of times when we talk about equitable development, we focus on the building. But one of the things that we've learned through the work at Smart Group America is you have to look at the place level. And the first thing, when you talk about how to create and achieve equitable development, whether it's in West Boulevard or downtown Charlotte or some of the many other neighborhoods in the city, one of the first things you have to do is actually define your universe. Define who is most vulnerable. Who now, whether it's a new development, whether it's a new transportation policy, whether it's new investments in workforce development, despite what of the interventions you may be using, you have to ask yourself, who are we trying to benefit? And oftentimes, this is just a snapshot of some of the tools that of organizations of how you can think about that. Obviously, communities of color would be defined potentially as most vulnerable to new investment or to displacement. Individuals who are low educated or low capacity. Renters is an example. Also, households with poverty. These are just snapshots. There could be so many more. But defining the universe of who we're trying to address is always the most important element of any equitable development strategy. Of course, one of the things that Smart Group America we like to do, we like to throw all the things at you, but this is really show you that you can't talk about equitable development in silos. It touches everything. Land use, transportation, human development capital, and the health, public health and the like, all through what we consider through a racial and economic justice lens. By bringing equity to the work that we're doing already, you'll begin to better inform whether it's better zoning policies that promote inclusion, better parking policies, better development policies, better public infrastructure, and the list goes on and on. The key thing here is to just show that there's intersectionality in terms of racial and economic justice, in terms of how we manage to build the environment to achieve equitable ends. So Emily and her team asked me to come in and say, look, there's a conversation we want to have around equitable development. And I've been on a lot of these Zoom discussions, and it's like, it gets very technical, the things of that nature. And I said, I'm not doing that. This is going to be a conversation. And as someone who is from Thomasville, Georgia, one of these we have is called the porch theory, which is sometimes you just sit on the porch and you tell a story. This is me inviting you to my porch to tell you a story of some work that we did recently over the last several years in a place called Somerville. And hopefully through this story, and I encourage you to ask me questions. There'll be some poll questions that's going to come up. But hopefully through this story, you'll begin to see a framework of how you could potentially take back to your neighborhood on how to not only identify strategies, create a framework, an action plan for equitable development, but also hopefully will give you some, some extra that you can actually do it. Because oftentimes one of the biggest challenges to achieving equitable development is the political will. The fact that you actually can do something. Because sometimes, as you saw in that earlier graph, there are just so many things that are happening, in our society. And you're like, can I do anything that can actually make a difference? And I hope this story that I'll share with you will hopefully give you that inspiration. So with that, welcome to my porch. Have a good iced tea, because I'm going to tell you a story. So starting in 2014, we were hearing from a number of our real estate developers, also a lot of elected officials that we work with very closely, about the fact that there is this huge pent up demand to walkable urban development that was outstripping supply, that places that were closer to their jobs, places that had great amenities to, let's say, grocery stores or good schools, that were easy access, places that had complete streets. The price premium was such that people who were renting there, cultural or institutions like churches, were being displaced because they could no longer stay there, and that we had to do something differently. So there was a mayor in a place called Somerville, Massachusetts, and let's make sure. And this is a snapshot. So if you were like, where's Somerville? So Somerville is basically right outside of Boston. It's sandwiched between Cambridge and MIT and a couple other growing institutions, campuses, college campuses. And one of the things that we found when you looked at Union Square is that they were seeing massive growth. If you've been in the Boston metro area, you know that they are having a massive boom, particularly around walkable urban places. So what was also going on? So one of the key elements, and this is going to be something that I think in the city of Charlotte, you guys can relate to, and that was the fact that they were making major investments in public transportation. They're anticipating a new Green Line extension that took them almost 20 plus years to finally get approved and finally get funding access for. Because of this new transit line development project, it was going to open up a number of new acres of redevelopment. And so in this case, Union Square was the neighborhood that was going to be this transformational redevelopment project. It was going to be 418 acres, 117 of which was going to be part of a massive development, and it was going to bring a whole host of new jobs. Now, as you can imagine, this caused a lot of consternation within the community. Previously, in another redevelopment project called Assembly Row, was marred with a lot of political friction because the community didn't feel that that project was designed for them. Also, that was one of the projects where you saw almost 15 years of legal challenges because the community wasn't bought in. So a new mayor came in, recognizing that he did not want that experience. That's one of the reasons why he got in office, because the mayor got kicked out. So you have a political leadership that said, look, we have to do something differently. And also you had a situation where the residents were thinking to themselves, how do we, knowing that this new transit line, this new transit station is coming to our community, how do we preserve the very thing that makes Somerville a home for immigrant population, a home for some beautiful cultural centric restaurants and ecosystems that have been thriving for decades? How do we maintain it? How do we maintain that for our kids and local residents for the futures to come? So one of the first things you have to recognize, and when we talk about equitable development, from a place-based standpoint, too often the conversation around equitable development centers on the building. And one of the first things I want to center here in this conversation is that you can't talk about equitable development and equitable development in terms of management unless by doing the building alone. You have to look at the entire neighborhood, because the economics of the place will drive all the benefits. So in this case, in Union Square, the question that we had to ask, we started off first was, how will the redevelopment of our neighborhood actually drive and improve the infrastructure and also deliver the community benefits? Because they're not inseparable. So this is going to show kind of the process that was laid out. Now, you may have heard this process before. So for Union Square, the city of Somerville did not necessarily have any capacity where their planning department was able to develop an equitable development strategy. That was not part of their purview. Also, traditionally, Somerville is part of their redevelopment authority, SRA, you see here, did not have a formal process for the community to actually advise SRA, which was the Somerville Redevelopment Authority, or the developer about the project. So this just goes to show you the process that was created. The city had this Somerville Redevelopment Authority create, because unfortunately there was not a legal structure, they created an advisory group where residents were able to participate. That's the CAC, the Community Advisory Commission, which helped the SRA decide which developer should get the RFQ, right? Then they created a locus process, which was then to advise the community on, before we actually execute the deal with the developer, what is the actual neighborhood strategy to achieve our economic performance metrics and our social equity metrics. Now, the next slide, you'll see the reality. You might understand this every day. What you see here at the top was the Somerville Transportation working with MassDOT. We have a Green Line extension timeline, right? You also had the planning department who was doing a neighborhood planning process. You also had the city of Somerville going through an actual zoning review. Then you had the locus process that's trying to develop a neighborhood plan. Then you have the community benefits agreement process. And then you had the CAC process that was trying to help inform the CRA, not only which master developer to select, but then eventually negotiate a future CBA agreement. Here's why this slide is key for any conversation of economic development. Oftentimes, groups, community groups, activists want to focus on the community benefits agreement. But turns out, like I showed the other previous slide, if you want to achieve equitable development, you have to look at all of the processes that are happening in your neighborhood, because each of those processes will impact whether or not your community 10 years from now, 20 years from now, insert your time horizon, actually achieve your equitable outcomes. And the other piece of here is we did not plan this. We were told as a group, as a consultant, that all of these things would have been dealt with and we can just focus on the neighborhood plan and the locus process. But as you can see here, we were juggling a lot of public processes, which meant there was a lot of meetings and a lot of fatigue. Moral of the story, it is hard work. So when you talk, one of the lessons that we learned when we did this project was, okay, we got to put this in a situation that's easy digestible. So we had 4 phases. We came in and we had the first phase, which is let's develop a neighborhood economic and social equity framework. Too often, we know how to make an economic framework. We do that a lot. I know in Charlotte, you have a number of business improvement districts whose sole responsibility is to look at their neighborhood and how to amplify the economic performance. What is missing is the conversation about social equity. Those things had to be done in concert. The second phase was creating a neighborhood action plan. The third phase was a benchmarking, performance metrics. And then the fourth was about who the heck is going to manage that. So here's the next part of my story. First phase, developing a strategic framework. One of the first things we did as part of our process was asking a simple question. Who should be at the table? Who are the strategy leaders? Oftentimes, when we talk about public community benefits, economic development, we normally just say the public should be, the community should be at the table. But there has to be some level of intentionality, and that it's not just the community should be at the table, but there are actually people in the community who inherently actually are managing the strategy. You have CDFIs, you have community groups, you have business groups who are literally every day, every year creating strategies and work plans and technical assistance and events that's literally adding the layer upon layer upon layer of how the neighborhood will mature over time. But they've never been brought together. Oftentimes you'll have the university would never have talked to the workforce training agency. Or you may not notice that the local development group never talked to the local churches. These are critical assets that oftentimes develop their own strategy in a silo. So we decided to bring them together along with the community. In addition to that, we asked them a simple question. So I'm going to go first. I'm going to go to this slide. So we asked the strategy leaders who were responsible, what is the most important thing you think the neighborhood should be doing for the next 10 years as part of the economic and social equity performance? So of the 34 strategy leaders we identified, we gave them about 50 plus strategy cards that they could focus on. Community benefits, climate change, public housing, public health, regional employment, and the like. Of those 54 strategy cards that we gave them, now mind you, the strategy leaders had to take it, they didn't pick it on themselves. They actually had to go back to their organizations or to their community representatives, whether it's a church, they will host an event within their church with their parishioners and the like to ask these questions. And they brought this back to us where they identified 10 strategy cards based on both. And this is just kind of show you some of the cards that were submitted back to us. Once they gave us their top 10, we asked them, rank them. So we want to protect the walkable urban character of our community. One of the things that we heard as a strategy, we need to improve the civic space infrastructure. We need more libraries. We need more educational safe space. One of the things they said they needed to prioritize as a neighborhood, we need open space because a lot of the spaces are being taken over by new commercial development. The next piece, economic development, parking, smart city infrastructure, housing, and also a place management organization, someone who's going to be responsible for. These are all the strategies that we saw being elevated. And then we asked them a simple question. As strategy leaders, along with the public, because these are public meetings, we want you to rank them. which ones are most important? This is key because sometimes when we ask a community, we ask ourselves, who's the community, right? And sometimes the loudest, right, will give you an answer. But it's always fascinating when you try to build the broadest coalition and broadest voices of what the community really think is the most important priority for the neighborhood to pursue. And that's something that we learned in the Somerville Union Square story. When we asked them to rank the number one issue they feel is most important for them, we, as someone on the outside, seeing the cost of housing go through the roof in Boston, we thought it would be affordable housing. Number one strategy would be to promote affordable housing. Actually, it wasn't. It was still number two. It was definitely in the top three. But the number one priority that folks who were affordable housing advocates, people who were business leaders, people who were in the religious community, people who were activists for immigrants, they all said they needed more job creation. And we were like, wow, that was very fascinating. And it wasn't for the fact that like we needed more jobs, it was the fact that they recognized that the way their city is funded, that they needed more revenues coming in to support the other initiatives that they need. They needed more commercial development. They needed more revenue because unfortunately, they were becoming a bedroom community for Boston, for Cambridge, and for some of these other communities. And if they did not, and the Union Square specifically was their last chance to actually have their own self-determination. Because in Massachusetts, they have caps on their property taxes. So therefore, that's without any other revenues, they're very limited in terms of how they can reinvest in themselves. So from that standpoint, we saw economic development, affordable housing, green space. One of the things we also found through the discussion and collaboration was that they cared a lot about mobility. We wanted to know, how can our community take advantage of future AVs? How can we get a situation where we have an aging population who need to get around and we're going to have fewer places for people to park? Those were key strategies that otherwise, when you have these discussions, don't oftentimes get lifted. Now, here's one of the first things I will ask you as folks who are on this call. What would be your number one, number two, or number three priority? And I think we have a poll that we're going to send around. So take a few moments to select, and then we'll announce the results. So their options are affordable housing, job creation, public health, or something else. Whether it's if it's in West Boulevard or any other neighborhood that you're working with, what would you identify the most important social equity or economic performance issue in your neighborhood? All right.
And Chris, you can just let me know when you want me to end that poll, but people can still submit their answers and those will be counted.
All right, 5 more seconds. If you have it clicked. All right, I think it looks like we got 60% of folks responding. So hopefully you can see, look, wow, 55% of respondents identified affordable housing as a top issue. I think that is something knowing the Charlotte market, I feel like that might have been the top one. Job creation was another. Public health was 25%. There was a significant number that folks that said other. For those who said other, could you unmute yourself or type in the chat box what would have been the other? Someone said great multimodal mobility. Okay. Any others? Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to shout it out.
Transportation.
Transportation. Yes. Yes. Anyone else?
There's a few more transportations being said in the chat box as well.
So here's the thing. Now we have, if we just talked about in the West Boulevard neighborhood, oh, pollution. That was a great one. That is a great one. That goes to the public health. As you can see, the conversation, again, oftentimes when you talk about equitable development, if you only focus on a community benefits agreement, you don't actually talk about the larger challenges. You can't talk about pollution in the building because pollution oftentimes is beyond just what's happening in the building, what's inside the building. And so the question you have to ask the community, where are those priorities? Because from those priorities, we can now develop an action plan. So in this case, let's talk about this action plan. Now, the strategy came together. They identified those priorities. Now, the question is, how are we going to achieve it? And so this is a simple template of how to take that strategy. So you have a strategy, you have an action plan, you have a cost. These are questions that we went through the community. Okay, what is the strategy? How will we achieve that strategy based on a timeline? How much would it cost? And this was actually fascinating. When we did this activity, we did not do it in a silo. We actually had the developer in the room who could provide insights on here are the economic benefits I think we are going to achieve through the development. We had a physical modeler who could show here's how much sales tax revenue that could be generated. And then we had other experts in different strategies who can give you like, okay, if we're going to have, let's say for West Boulevard, we want to create 1,000 new affordable housing units in the next 10 years, there's clearly a cost associated with it. So we were able to identify the strategy, an action plan, a cost, who was responsible for it, and how we're going to pay for it. Because again, economic benefits of a place is directly tied to the social equity performance. You cannot get the social equity unless you know what the economic performance of your community is going to be. So this is a good template. So from there, you can see as an example, as each of the strategies that you see here had a working group. And they would go back and say, okay, we want civic space. So let's talk about it. They wanted to focus on the library. They went out, did their research. They found out we need about $11.3 million to build out a library. Some folks, another working group for green space, we think we need about 3 acres of parks and open space within the neighborhood. They went out, did the research. And you can see here for each of the elements of the neighborhood strategy had a cost associated with it. Now, the funny thing about this exercise was that it actually opened everyone's eyes, right? Once you start putting costs to all the things you want to ask, you realize it costs a lot of money to do good development, right? But the flip side of that was you also had the developer who would say, well, I can't do that unless I get a density bonus, because that way I can potentially promote more affordable housing. Or you wouldn't have known that, let's say, a CDFI already had a grant proposal potentially to do some workforce training development. All of those conversations we're beginning to find out, like, oh, you're doing that? Well, let's layer our strategy on top of your current initiative to actually achieve the goals that we want. And that was the most important element about this conversation. The next part of that feeds into, okay, now we have these strategies. Where is the money coming from? Should it come from the city? Could it come from a community benefit agreement, meaning negotiations with any developer? And this was the most important part. Sometimes when we talk about equitable development, you focus on one project. But when you can do the equitable development strategy, you can realize you open up more avenues to pay for the things that you want. So the final result, we were able to create strategic and action plan on all of their strategies where we knew who's responsible for leading the strategy, right? So you'll see here, one of the top priorities was to attain and attract more employers into the Union Square neighborhood. Who's going to be responsible for that strategy? So it was the local chamber, the city, and the community group that they identified. How much was going to cost to do this particular strategy? What can a developer do? And then you can begin to see at some points, there is elements where, yes, this has to be put in the CBA, or maybe we can leverage on the state, we can leverage on another group. This flushes out a little bit more. And as you can see, each of these strategies had a plan of action. And this is something and an organization that was responsible for it. And this is why it's important. The key element of equitable development is about ownership of change, management of change. We were able now to talk to the groups who are in the community who had authority and had built up trust and relationship, not the developer, and sometimes not even the city. These individuals, these groups, these activists who are on the front line doing the day-to-day work are more likely to be able to look back and say, yes, we can say, we have ownership of the change. Therefore, the residents that are there are more likely to trust when a developer comes in with this group or these collection of groups around a housing strategy. They're more likely to trust it. And that's the key element of equitable development. You have to build trust. And the only way you can build trust is bringing partners in on the front end. Now, I said that to say we had this fancy strategy that now has an action plan, and then we had to ask a simple question, which is phase 3.
Christopher, there was a question in the chat box,
sure.
if I can jump in.
Yeah,
was
go ahead.
there inclusionary zoning? I think I saw it in your matrix, but I wanted you to talk to that for a moment.
Oh,
Yeah.
great question. So that was a very good question. So yes, inclusionary housing policy was included in their mix. One of the things I would say, though, why I'm glad you asked that question, is because there was a feedback loop. Every time an idea, a policy came on, we were able to show in real time. We would have a sample pro forma on the screen, and someone would say, I think we should have an inclusionary housing as a way to achieve our housing strategy, right? We would show, okay, well, this would be the impact of the inclusionary housing policy on this type of project. And then you would see, oh, turns out that if this inclusionary housing policy will create a new budget gap, right, in the project. The developer said, I think that's a good idea, but now I can't finance the project. Through engagement with the developer, the community, and the city, they would say, okay, how could we alleviate that? Some people would say, oh, give a density bonus. Would that work? Or maybe we can reduce the parking minimums, right? Could that work? But they were able to see the pressure points in the budget, right, to help the developer get to what they wanted to happen. But also, the developer were able to see, oh, you know what? If I see this strategy, I can now try to reposition and develop new partnerships with people to deliver the outcome they want. And unfortunately, too often, that conversation never happens. And that was the beauty, I think, of this exercise, was that you were able to have those trade-offs and realize that sometimes you're like, you know what? We may not get all the housing from this development project, but you know what? The developer working with us, we can go advocate to the city, to the state, or even find other federal resources to actually augment that, because maybe that would be a better strategy to achieve the outcome. And I think that was the piece, having that common table to have that discussion, that was really, really truly insightful. And please, if there are more questions, please jump, because I just can't see the chat box in front of me. So this is the action plan. So the next question from the city was that one of the things that we learned as we were doing this exercise, remember how I showed you the slide of all the processes that were going on? Well, the city now, in the midst of a neighborhood planning process, began to change the neighborhood plan. They're like, oh, wait, we need to include inclusionary housing. We need to include a density bonus. We need to actually reduce parking minimums, because these are things we know the community wants. And if the developer sees that, they can actually now, let's make it by right. So that was actually one of the fascinating things. But one of the other things that we realized we had to do, and this came from the request of the city, was whether or not, if we did these things, all the strategies that we talked about, the neighborhood planning changes, the strategies that were being identified, will it actually put a thumb on the needle? Because too often, sometimes we talk about equitable development as if it's in a vacuum. Yes, you could do these, tactical things of anti-displacement, but really add up. And so from this case, this is the question that I will ask you guys in a second. For Somerville, they identify a number of metrics that they said, look, we want to test our current strategy against. So they were really concerned about housing and transportation costs. For individuals who are making 80% area median income and lower. Another piece, they wanted to reduce the number of low-income population who are having housing cost burden. They identified they wanted more jobs, quicker accessible to low-income families. They wanted to make sure that they were maintaining and improving school quality. One of the other drivers, they wanted to make sure that they had transit accessibility increasing, and having the ability for particularly their Asian population to be able to get around Union Square without a car. So they identified these metrics. What you see here, the platinum walk-ups, we were able to do an analysis of the entire land use of the Boston metro area and analyze their economic and social equity performance and of walkable urban places. And so what you see here, platinum walkable urban places are the best walkable and most inclusive. So in the platinum walkable urban area in Boston, Massachusetts, the benchmark was like 41%. So if you're living in the highest economic performing and highest social equity performance, the benchmark was 41%. Union Square at this time was actually performing even better than some of the platinums, right? And you can see this was a snapshot of where Union Square sat as it relates to other neighborhoods. Because here's the thing, this is about place. It's not just about where you live, it's whether or not how affordable is your place compared to the other neighborhood. How inclusive is your place compared to other neighborhoods, right? Well, this is what we found. So as you can see in the blue box is the present day Somerville. 39% of their 80% AMI spend on housing and transportation costs. Of the current low-income housing spending, it was less than 39%. The share of Union Square residents who can commute without car was 53%. What you see in the first box called BAU, that's business as usual. If Union Square, if the community didn't do anything, just ignore the problem, right? Just let the market do what it do. You can see here that Union Square, for individuals who are 80% AMI and lower, would see dramatic increase of their housing and transportation costs. That full stop. Moral story here, if they did not do anything, they know that they're going to push people out. Their neighborhood would no longer be affordable. They also saw that, yes, we will have more jobs. We will have more access to mobility, but unfortunately, the individuals who live in our community today won't have access. What you see in the next two columns was what happens if you did, again, we created a projection model based on national trends and literature. We were able to then take the neighborhood plan, the strategic plan that they just developed, and we're able to project and give some guidance of what could potentially happen to the existing population. And what you saw in summary here, the 39% to 35%, the partial is like, let's say you did only a third of the strategy, right? And that includes, let's say you didn't meet all your housing goals. Let's say you did 50% of it, right? You could maintain your existing 10 years out. You would maintain your current household transportation ratio. But if you fully implement it 10 years from now, people who are 80% AMI today will actually see a reduction in their housing and transportation costs. And moral of the story is that yes, now we have a strategy that actually will provide a direct benefit to the community. By having this level of analysis, we were able to show the city why, from a political will standpoint, it was important to do some of the things that the community was asking for, but I also showed the community that now they actually had a document and strategies that actually had a positive impact on their lives. And that was a clear and important, and I should say necessary data set to get us to the next phase. So first question, before we get to that, what are your measures of success? If you're looking at the neighborhood, what would you define as the metrics that will let you, whether you're the city or if you're a community group activist, to know that your community is growing up correctly, right? Like if you had a 401k, if you're privileged to have a 401k, and you went to your financial advisor, they would ask you, where do you want to be 10 years from now? What does it look like? So for this standpoint, I'm going to open it up. In the chat box, type, what would be your vision of, let's say, whether it's West Boulevard neighborhood in Charlotte or your own neighborhood? What would be your definition of success? What would it be? Type, and we'll give folks about a minute or two to answer that. And feel free to unmute yourself as well.
So the chat box is a little quiet. Maybe, Christopher, you can give some examples of what you're thinking. We see walkability, more equitable jobs, access to ABC transportation, connectivity. They're starting to come in.
Yeah, perfect. Those are all great.
Jobs.
So again, all families having access to the same schools, right? Safe and equitable mobility for exactly right. The key thing here is, much like Somerville, you have to identify the success, the metric, and then measure it. Because when you look 10 years from now, you have to ask yourself a simple question. Did you achieve the things? Someone says cost of living. Exactly. Cost of living for whom, right? For the existing residents. You can't talk about cost of living in the abstract. You actually have to start developing a platform and a series of strategies and action plan that actually drives the outcome that you want. And a key element, oh, there's another one, better connection to businesses and neighborhoods. Yes, these are all great. Clean water, this is all perfect. Again, you're gonna have different metrics of what you decide your future is gonna be. And this is the key element of the development, equitable development outcomes. We all know where we are today. Systematic racism, disparities, high pedestrian count fatalities because of lack of connection. But you know what? That doesn't have to be our future. The question we have to now do is, can we build a roadmap that has all the players, the community together, with the city, with the private sector, in agreement of what that vision should be? And can we develop a framework where we could do triage and trade-offs and actually manage that growth, that change? And that, to me, is what is most important in the conversation today, because unfortunately, we haven't given communities at the place level the ability to manage their future. So we identified some of the same drivers of economic development that you want to monitor over a period of time. So here's a snapshot. When we were able to go back to the city, and we said, look, based on your strategy, this is where we think you're going to be now and 10 years from now. So what you see in the blue, remember how I said we did an analysis of all the walkable urban places in the metro area. We ranked them, as you can see here, affordability on the bottom, accessibility and opportunity. So the more successful opportunity you are, the higher your economic performance is. You know, more commercial, more business activity. Greater housing affordability, you just have great housing affordability. So basically you want your neighborhood to be over here, right? So what you see in yellow here is where Somerville was in 2016. If Somerville did nothing, right, the business as usual, Somerville would go backwards. And you can see it here in the red, right here. And hopefully you can see that. Oh, it's a little sensitive. Sorry. Would go in the red. That is what we call displacement. When your neighborhood, in relationship to the rest of the market, when your neighborhood is losing affordability, but still maintaining its economic prominence, that is where displacement happens. Where you want your neighborhood to go in relationship to the broader neighborhood and to the larger metro area as well as nationally is where you see in the brown and the green. So you see here in the brown, that's what happened. We basically were able to show the city, if you did half of the things, you'll just stay where you are. And you may say, that's a good thing, Christopher. 10 years from now, we would be where we're at today. I guarantee you, if you talk to that mother of like two or three kids, who is, you know, trying to work day in, day out, she will tell you 10 years from now, she doesn't want to be in the same space. So it's imperative that we create strategies and initiatives that allows not only the future of the neighborhood, but also the families who are there now to benefit. And that's why being able to show to the city, as you can see here in the green, that Somerville not only became more affordable for its residents, but also improved this economic performance for its residents. That was key to showing why those strategies were important. Now, again, as I said before, these are some of the findings. I'm not going to speak more to it because we already talked about that. But then this is the piece that was the part I think you're going to get really excited about. Maybe, maybe not. Hear me out. I have some more iced tea for you. One of the questions that the community kept asking us as we were going back and forth, engaging with the residents, was around who's responsible for managing these strategies. The city, I'm sure in the city of Somerville, Charlotte, would say that's not our responsibility. We do not have time. We do not have the capacity to be managing this on the day-to-day basis, right? The developer was like, I don't have capacity to manage the housing, the economic, the civic space, the climate, the mobility strategy of the neighborhood. Like, no. And it turns out this conversation kept going and going, and it was recognized that, you know what, we need a community quarterback that could be, that's responsible, that could be owned by us, could be managed by us. And recognizing that the community benefits beyond just your infrastructure need, but also your social equity needs, has to be tied to the economic success. And so in many ways, it was, could we create a place-based organization that was like a business improvement district that knew how to generate the economic performance, but also knew how to tie that performance to ensure that the equity, social equity outcomes that we all want was actually achieved. Now, here, and also recognizing that this was not someone who was just looking at a project per project, was looking at it at a holistic level. And so with that, through the process, the city recognized that, you know what, we did not have a legal framework for neighborhood groups, the strategy leaders, the residents to actually be a part of this conversation. And so in 2017, the city of Somerville established what is called a community benefits neighborhood designation. And basically it legalized for community to come together to legally, where the city can now go in a direct connection relationship as well as a developer. The community groups could say, hey, we're gonna vote for a neighborhood council. So you will run to be on the neighborhood council. The neighborhood council will be responsible for creating the strategy for the neighborhood. That neighborhood council will also be able to go and negotiate with, whether it's with the city, whether it's with a developer, community benefits agreement. But also, here's the kicker, the city of Somerville recognized that, you know what, there may be some neighborhoods that may not have any resources, right? And it may not be the lead, shouldn't take the lead because for a variety of reasons. So the city said on top of the neighborhood council, the city in their negotiations with future developers or other projects that they're working on, they would create neighborhood-based funds that would support the community benefits plan that's being created. This had never been done in the state of Massachusetts. This was totally revolutionary. The city saying, we're gonna give power to the local residents, and then we're gonna work in concert with them to manage the social equity and economic performance moving forward. So what happened? For the city of Union Square, this at December 2019, actually 2018, they voted. They identified 15 individuals to be on the neighborhood council. That neighborhood council formed, created bylaws, and was able to now negotiate with the master developer alongside the Somerville Redevelopment Authority. And here's what is funny, and hopefully I can show this a little bit better, maybe here. So if you look at, a little sensitive, the categories here that was part of the community benefits agreement negotiations, many of the items are the clear strategies that were dictated in the locus process. The key thing here is that you have to have a strategy and know what you want before a developer comes in. What we find time and time again for developers, what makes making equitable development happen easier is that developers have to spend so much time trying to figure out what the community wants. And what we found out through this process, by having the community go through an exercise where they can develop their vision, develop their strategy, and identify their action plan, they were able to get this done in a matter of 6 to 7 months, which is much true for a lot of community development agreements.
We have a question, Christopher, that I think is worth addressing from Christina. How does this differ for North Carolina, a Dillon state, versus Massachusetts, a home rule state? And does Charlotte have a chance to actually create a community benefits fund? I believe is the question.
And remind me of the Dillon rule again, to make sure I get this clarification again. And I think that was Christina.
Christina, yeah. Christina, if you're there.
A little bit?
Yeah, so in a Dillon state like North Carolina, the state legislature has to approve and oversee all kinds of funding for, so Charlotte, in order to start, it's my understanding, and there is some limitations, community benefit fund or do developer fee agreements, they would have to have state approval to do so. At a home rule state, that is not true. Which is true for Massachusetts. And they could do that in and of themselves under their own home rule designation for a developer. So in the state of North Carolina, and someone, if Taiwo's on the call, he could probably speak to this, is we are very limited for developer fee collection and the use to make those funds fungible across our city. We would need the state to approve them in some way, shape, or form.
Right. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Christina, but you do actually allow for community benefit, I should say community improvement or business improvement districts, you're allowed to do special tax assessment districts, correct?
I would need someone else to answer that limit. I do not know how that works as well. I
We
think
do
you
have,
can.
yeah, we do have something like that. This is Taiwo, yes, but not as robust as you will have in other places. But we do
Right.
locally
So
to have a benefit assessment.
exactly right. So in many ways, it's a great question because there are definitely trade-offs and of course limitations, right? There are local limitations in terms of, as I said before, for Somerville, the community had no legal authority to actually even engage in the conversation, right? So they had to create one. That may be true for the state of North Carolina. Now, one of the things that we've learned in some other cities that may have some, I don't know if they have a similar the Dillon rule, but they look at their existing authority. So for example, if you had the ability to do a special assessment, one of the things you could potentially do as part of that special assessment requirement when it comes before the city council, we've seen that there may be some equity requirements embedded in that. So for example, here in DC, some of the newer business improvement districts now have to have a community component. Who's on the board? Who's responsible for management of it? What's the strategy that's advised? And so there are some corporate structural, as those special assessment districts are being created, that you may be able to influence. Now, again, it has to be determined. I think this is the conversation we can have as a follow-up of providing some of the examples of how you might be able to use your existing authority to get to it. It won't be perfect, and that's a key thing too. None of these processes are perfect, right? But what it does try to do is really try to fill in the gap of some of the mistrust and hope to create a platform. Because again, you don't need any legal authority to create shared tables, right? You don't need any legal authority to bring a developer, a city, and the community together, right? You don't need legal authority to create a community quarterback where developers will find, like, I want to be a part of that conversation too. The question really is, how can you create a framework that people can buy into? And that would be something Emily's going to talk about coalition building. The key thing is having the process. One of the things I would say lessons learned, in addition to doing this well, we find that it's hard to get consensus, right? We didn't get consensus on community leaders. I know in Charlotte that if you ask who represents West Boulevard, you're going to throw out 10 or 15 different names, right? And if you did a whole polling of the residents, they'll have 10 or different names in those names. That's a challenge. Especially now, there are a lot of adversarial groups. Some groups who just want to defer the process. Some groups that just who are focused on single issues. That's always a challenge. The other challenge I will say is that this process has to deal with trade-offs versus the wish list. There's 10,000 things you can ask for, but sometimes you have to have some level of being realistic. But having that shared table to be able to have those conversations was very key. The last thing I would tell you is sometimes it's in your interest to have a third-party validator. Like in the case of Somerville, it was us coming in and showing the data, showing the research, and doing the analysis and community engagement. But it also is in the interest of the city to let us get beat up, right? Because I know a lot of you who may be working in the cities in the local government recognize that sometimes having residents yelling at you every single day, every night is not ideal. So sometimes it's important to have a third party to take those blows for you and be the punching bag, or do both. But one of the things I will also say that even in places like that may have legal limitations, right, to do this type of framework or do it as fully, what we're also finding in a lot of communities are low-hanging fruits. How can, whether it's residents or even the city, advocate for equitable development? And one of the things I would just want to share here is something that we were seeing like in the state of Hawaii. This is true for the city of Minneapolis. A number of cities are beginning to do this as well as community groups, which is, look, develop an equitable development principles. And I know the city of Charlotte has a number of these already published, but then how you operationalize it. So one of the things we're seeing that might be a low-hanging fruit is for your key neighborhoods that you want to focus on, develop a scorecard. Develop a way where when a developer comes in and says, hey, I want to get zoning approval, be able to have a public-facing interaction with that developer to say, look, here's your development. Here's how it scores on transportation. Here's how it scores on housing, safety, environment, and the like, and use that as a way to get better projects. We're beginning to see a lot of groups be able to develop their, whereas it's housing groups working with other stakeholders to develop their neighborhood scorecard to say these are things that we care about, and it's kind of their advocacy way, their ability to engage both the city as well as to the developer of what they want. Again, not legal documents. Now, in the case of Minneapolis, they've actually institutionalized it. So if you're a developer and you want to get approval, they were basically saying you can't get approval unless you make the bare minimum on our community scorecard. Others are just using traditional community organizing and advocacy. The point being is there are a number of ways to shape it, but the point is you got to know what you're trying to achieve the next 10 years to undo the systematic racism, the classism, and all the other challenges that we're having in our built environment. So again, I really enjoyed this discussion. I hope you enjoyed my porch. These are just basic takeaways. We got to better inform. We have to invite the community in, and we have to do a better job of communicating what we're trying to achieve. And I think if you take some of these lessons, I think you'll find that we can really get a lot more equitable development done on the ground. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions and answers. I know my colleague Emily is going to speak sometime about coalition building, but again, thank you for the honor and privilege for allowing me, for someone from small town Georgia, to talk to my friends in Charlotte. So thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Emily.
Christopher, thank you so much. We enjoyed your porch, and I like my sweet tea half and half, you know, sweet, unsweet. So that's what I was sipping on. We've gotten a lot of comments, particularly around the scorecard, the last piece that you shared, but I would definitely like to use some of this time to have a conversation. And I would ask, you know, we've had a lot of good conversation going on in the chat. So I would like to open it up to the group before we switch over. I do have a brief presentation about coalition building, but I'd really like us to be able to use this time to have a conversation with Christopher. Please, floor is open. Let's ask questions. Let's ask the hard questions if anybody wants to start. Remember, it's a learning exchange. So, you know, as we are hearing from you, we'll learn a little bit more about what's going on in the ground in Charlotte. Maybe you have some examples, experiences that you want to share, and we can sort of look at them together in this forum.
Hi, Christopher, thanks so much. This has been great. I have a question. In this virtual COVID world that we're in, what techniques do you think would be best to take to get to grassroots approaches at this point that you could sort of segue from your learning into a virtual world?
That's a great question, and there's no easy answer. There's going to have to be a balance. One of the lessons that we did learn from the process in Somerville, as you notice, I kept identifying strategy leaders. And one of the reasons for that was we needed individuals who were already champions in their neighborhood, right? Because look, Christopher Coe's coming from DC saying, hey, I'm here to help. No one's going to trust me. No one's going to believe that, right? But having those strategy leaders, especially now in COVID, is probably even more important because unfortunately, we're not going to be able to touch everyone at the same time. But having community champions at the table at the beginning allows you to, again, it's relationship building. The second piece is, I will be very honest with you, in this moment of COVID, over communication is the best strategy. So one of the examples I would say in this case in the virtual world is that while you may have to limit, having easy access. Transparency is key. So when you're having these conversations, making sure you get access. Now, here's the key thing. You may say, but everyone doesn't have internet. Everyone may not have the ability. Exactly. That also means you need to change the process of how people can interact, right? One of the things that you may want to do is, hey, working with those strategy leaders, be able to actually empower them to be community aggregators and hold community meetings as well in their own spaces. Again, that's why I think the strategy leader discussion that we had early on was so important because as we get into these places where you can't due to the inequities in our system, you actually have to make sure that you have the community trust. And oftentimes the community trust will trust their pastor, right? More they may trust the city. So if you can work with those community validators, you actually could reduce some of the friction and tension that comes in the moments like this where you can't have those big community meetings anymore. But still recognizing that you want to be transparent, so when you can, record them, transcribe them, share them, and the like. Now, the other side of that is a lesson to be, and this is going to be very hard for some of my developer friends. Sometimes you got to slow down. Everything doesn't have to move today, right? And that's a difficult thing to say, right? What we don't want to happen is a year from now, 2 years from now, decisions that were made in, behind closed doors, leaving our existing population in a more vulnerable situation, right? That only creates more distrust, bitterness, right? And it doesn't get us to the place that we want to go to. So one, have relationships with those community validation strategists is key on the front end. Two, allowing greater transparency. And then three, just deciding that some decisions can be delayed. Now, those are decisions that can't be delayed, then I just say refer to 1 and 2.
That's great, Christopher. Thank you so much. I felt like, there was some strong response around the community validators. And I think that your point around slowing projects down is really important. And maybe, obviously, we're all learning some of those hard lessons during this crisis. But certainly it's always been a challenge with community engagement, early and often. And sometimes it means taking time in order to have those voices at the table.
Emily, can I just say something in response to that?
Please.
And this is why having strategies are so important. When things get rough, right? When people are siloed, or for, in this case, COVID, you like to think that we all have a document or a framework that we all can agree to, right? That's the problem, right? The fact that oftentimes when we talk about equitable development, we're talking about building specific. Imagine if we went upstream and we knew that the city was abiding by our equitable development plan for the neighborhood. If we knew that we have institutionalized the permitting process as it pertains because the neighborhood plan has already baked it in. If we knew that already, we can let the system run its course and we can evaluate that, right? But it's because we don't trust it. We don't have a coordinating strategy. We don't have a process where people have had that building trust. We're now scared that someone may slip something through. And I think that's the key thing that, again, is different. It creates more work, but having those community development strategies on the front end allows us to build that trust so that, yes, we can let these things go forward because we've created a process where these things will come out. The outcome of it is something we all are bought into. So
that's great. Does anybody else have a question? We have a little bit more time. We can sort of pick Christopher's brain while he is on the spot.
Hi, Emily. This is Kenya Templeton.
Hi, Kenya. Welcome back.
I have a question. For Charlotte, what I find is that most of the time we don't even know about the developments that are coming, especially in certain neighborhoods. So how do we find out what developments are coming ahead of time versus going down your street? And for the example, where I live in Hidden Valley, which is an area that is beginning to gentrify, every time I ride my bike to the opposite side of the neighborhood, I find a whole nother project that's coming up.
that is a great question, which goes back to my framework. You want to have a frame, like, before someone even shows up. If I'm a developer, right, here's the ideal. If you're an active advocate, one of the first things I would say to you is that you definitely need to develop a dialogue with your city planning and zoning team, because oftentimes they are on the front end of either solicit or unsolicited proposals, right, changes. So having that dialogue, that's a key element. In certain markets, and I'm not sure about Charlotte, do you guys have like community or neighborhood councils, or like here in DC, if a developer wants to get something passed or zoning approval, there has to be some level of community engagement. Is that a process that's in Charlotte as well, or do you have an equivalent? Just curious right now.
In our community, we actually have 2 neighborhood organizations, which in and of itself is confusing, but it's not something that happens across the board in Charlotte.
Right. This is one of those elements where I think this is about capacity building. And again, having those neighborhood organizations that are there, that are tasked with developing that relationship with the city, but also more importantly, particularly if you're having commercial assets, right? One of the things that we had learned about the Somerville model, about having the strategy leaders there, by having that table, we were able to hear from the head of the small business association that was along the corridor of the neighborhood, who would tell us, they would meet regularly. Hey, by the way, 2 stores are thinking they're about coming, or so-and-so restaurant is closing and it might be a development opportunity. You may find, that's why, as anything with community, you've got to have those conversations, and creating that shared table is so key. The second piece of that, though, is what I think was revealed in the Somerville work and also through the scorecards development. When the community self-organized and put the stick in the ground that says, this is what we define as good projects, any developer who's coming from the outside, maybe let's say they're not part of the neighborhood, who just say, hey, this is a great neighborhood, I want to do a project, trust me, they're doing the hard work of figuring out like what's going on in the neighborhood, what's happening. And if you plant the flag that says West Boulevard, or your neighborhood, I'm sorry, I missed the neighborhood you're maybe in, but your neighborhood is, this is our definition of equitable development in our community, and we're going to be advocating for that. That sends that's a market signal to any developer, because that lets them know if they go in front of the city council member, i.e. you talking to your city council member, and they don't say these things, right, as part of their project, or demonstrate how they're trying to support those local initiatives, they recognize that their project might get slowed. And developers, investors, hate time is critical. Time is money for them. So anything they could do to get to the city approval process the fastest, they will do. But unfortunately, they don't know it when they come in. So I highly encourage you to organize, put a stick in. It won't be perfect. I agree. It won't be perfect. But don't let the enemy be how's it go? Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So.
Yeah, this is Taiwo. And I don't know if you can hear me well. Christopher, thank you so much. This is great. This is one thing that I'm going to take on, hopefully early in the coming year, how to partner with our community organizations. When I worked in California as a planner, they were really organized, highly organized. And especially for the rezoning process, we need to empower our residents, we need to empower community advocates. And sometimes community leaders don't even know what their members want, and members don't know what the leaders want. And so even within the community organizations, there's no agreement. I think this is something I would like to take on. So much going on right now, but something in 21, I definitely would like to meet with different neighborhood leaders in Charlotte and see how we as a planning department can help organize them better, for a smarter city. So to
yeah,
thank you very
that's
much.
Great. That's great. And I tell people all the time, and a community that's organized, it's more likely to get what it's going to be still hard. There's going to be more likely to get what they want versus a community that's not organized. Because at the end of the day, the city or the developer is going to ask, what do you want, right? Secondly, I think another experience that we're seeing on the transportation side is that we need more yes in my backyards, right? We need more YIMBYs, but not just in YIMBYs in a sense of like promoting more density, but we're actually we want the community to get excited about our projects, right? From a developer standpoint. So, but the thing is, in order to get there, I always encourage communities to say, give me your playbook, your yes. What can I get to yes? What would get you so excited? And when you turn it that way, and I've seen this in a couple of my developers who are using these kind of like really intensive community engagement processes to develop those strategies, where once they collaboratively working with the community to develop the project, and it could be a massive development project or even a single project, they love taking the community with them to those zoning meetings, taking them to the mayor's office, taking them to the city council or to the state legislature who may be potentially pushing a bill that's going to promote more financing or funding or something like that, because it's no longer developer versus community, it's the developer with community. And the better the community can actually gauge on what it would take to get them to yes, I guarantee you will find developers who are willing to like stand in unison with you. But unfortunately, there's been this crazy tension and gap that you have to be adversarial. What we're trying to create is tables where we can become a team. And I think that's what, I think to your comments earlier, that is something that we need more of. Thank you, Tyler, for those comments.
Hey, Christopher, this is Shannon. Can you hear me?
Shannon, I can hear you.
Great. With Sustain Charlotte. And I'm just wondering, you know, thinking about the metrics in the scorecard, you know, one thing that, you know, we don't talk about a whole lot in this community, especially in, you know, rezoning meetings and, you know, other council conversations regarding development, is affordable transportation. We don't really ask petitioners, you know, who are seeking rezonings to, you know, talk about what is the cost of transportation going to be. You know, there's questions about what is the cost of housing, you know, the rent, that's a major focus. They ask for vehicle trips generated, you know, by the development, but nothing really that gets to the cost of transportation. I'm just wondering if you've seen other communities require that as part of the rezoning process. You know, is that something that can be, you know, estimated? You know, just what you've seen on that front to make the transportation cost more part of the conversation.
This is why creating a much more inclusive table is important. This is why looking beyond just the building approval for a building or a project is so important, because transportation sometimes is a regional issue, right? Or it could be a neighborhood issue, right? I'll give an example in Somerville. Their big transportation affordability was bringing more transit, right, to the neighborhood. That can be paid for by the neighborhood itself, right? That's not a developer only. That has to come from the city, coming from the state, and maybe in many cases the federal government. By having all the stakeholders at a table, you'll be able to realize who's responsible for promoting affordable transportation options in the neighborhood. And you found out in that case, it was twofold. The city needed to generate enough revenue to provide a match, right, for the state, right? So then the city would say, look, residents, if we want more affordable transportation options, we need to generate enough sales tax in this development deal to give our match. And the community is like, oh, so how much is that? Well, we need about $30 million over a course of a certain period of time. Well, then we were able to show them, well, if you take $30 million out of the pot of money that's available, that may leave you with, you know, let's say it was 100 million, you may not have 70 million left, right? That's one bucket. Then they say, well, what about connectivity? Well, the developer says, look, if you want to create walkability, you want safe streets, you want more access, right? And well, I need to spend X number of dollars on improving all the existing sidewalks or lack thereof, right, in the community. Here's the cost of that. And that was what I found so illuminating, because to your point, you find out there are strategies that are happening outside of development itself that will have a direct impact. So in this case, what the city eventually did was able to, where appropriate, so within the zoning, it had a complete streets policy requirement embedded in it, right? Now, at the same time, they also had other elements that spoke to we are going to change the some of the zoning, right, of this area because we need more commercial development to be able to generate the revenues we need to pay for the transit line. All of those things were layered. The key element here to, I think that may be, applicable is you need to put everything on the table and then decide which tool is the most appropriate. And sometimes it's not a zoning answer, right? Sometimes it's not a development answer. It might be that we need to go talk to the hospital that's running all the shuttles in our neighborhood to actually get them better coordinated with the transit agency, right? So that's the power that I want to speak here to, and that's why you have to have these type of tables. Now, the other answer that I can, give it to you is yes. As you saw in the Equitable Scorecard, they would have a section on transportation, and the community would define what those transportation objectives would be. So it may be if you're going to build a building or a master plan development, it needs to have complete streets. Did they have that, right? Are they practicing transportation demand management? So for example, it may be office tenants, right? How are your tenants getting here? Does this project have a clear understanding that they're going to be promoting transit, right? There are certain things you can do and that can be embedded in whether it's in the zoning process or a part of some other evaluation process that you may have naturally in your setting. The things you can do, but the thing is, make sure you scale it to the right person and who's responsible for it. And you can't figure that out unless you do it on the back end strategy wise. So hopefully that gives you some ideas about approaching how to do that. But I think one of the things I would say, Emily, hopefully we're capturing some of these questions because this could be part of the response that we'll get back in terms of showing some examples of some of these ones I'm calling out as well. So.
Definitely. I am doing my best to document this conversation, which is great. I think we have time for one more question, and then we're going to jump into a quick presentation, a deeper dive on coalitions and coalition building, which is something that was discussed in Christopher's presentation and is certainly something that's threaded through all of these pieces around building trust and building a table in order to have these conversations. So if there's one more question, we can take it. All right. Well, and I just want to thank Christopher again. He's going to be with us, so we can continue to bounce some questions in the chat box if you have them. Please feel free. We're going to be here for another 30 minutes, so stay with us. And just really great to think about, what the priorities are, defining what success looks like, building that framework, and specifically in this case, thinking about activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations. So how we can build our community so that it's more walkable, bikeable, rollable for our community members. And so with that, I would like to try and share my screen. Let's see which screen I will show. And is everyone with me here? So stop me if there are any issues, but I'm going to talk today about cross-sectoral coalitions. Oh, I'm sorry, this is an outdated version, but we'll just move through. I don't think that it's going to interrupt what we're going to talk about. So looking at the learning objectives for today, as we already discussed, we're going to talk about building cross-sectoral coalitions when creating complete streets, identifying coalition partners, looking about how to create and organize a coalition, and understanding how to develop a plan. I'm going to move through this really quickly because we definitely had a lot of good conversation for equitable development. So I just wanted to go through this briefly. I think it, really threads through the conversation that we had just now. I think if we talk about, where we're headed as a city in Charlotte, coalition building is huge. And I think if we're looking at even how we ended up here today, Smart Growth America partnering with Rayo Community Health, which is traditionally a health organization, has brought in an organization like ours to coordinate this workshop with Sustain Charlotte. So you already have right there a multi-sectoral coalition and essentially a multi-sectoral approach to this work. And so there's a lot that can be built around that. So what is a coalition? A coalition is a partnership of individuals, organizations that work towards a specific shared goal that is larger than any one of them could achieve on their own. You've probably worked on one or several coalitions before and probably already have an idea of what they entail. In fact, I think we have a polling question, Meg, if you're there. If you could share that polling question now, and we will look to see, are you currently in or have been in any coalitions? This is just sort of, grounding, level setting. Let's think about what coalitions are. We have the definition there. And if you can just let us know if you have been in, are currently in any coalitions. We see answers coming in. We've got plenty of people in a transportation coalition, a neighborhood coalition, a few in a health coalition. Keep answering and we'll just see how this all shakes out. We've got 50% voted, so we'll give you a few more seconds to go ahead and let us know what type of coalition, if any, you have been a part of. Great.
Okay,
So
as 5 seconds.
I'm sorry?
I'll close it in about 5 seconds here.
Great, great. Thank you, Meg. All right. So it looks like, and this is not surprising since we're all here, discussing Active People, Healthy Nation, the initiative, and talking about activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations. Certainly, we've got a lot of people who have worked with transportation. I'm glad to see there are a lot of people who've worked in neighborhood coalitions, a few in the health coalition, school, and certainly we've got a number of people who have not participated in a coalition. So that's great. Thank you for sharing. So we'll just continue the conversation. Why would we work with a coalition? Coalitions are win-win opportunities. Forming a new coalition or partnering with an already existing coalition can help you achieve your goal. It can also benefit individual members or organizations. Benefits to the mission: accomplish more than working alone. You can expand your expertise. A coalition working together can also have increased recognition and credibility. And finally, a coalition can leverage the networks of all individual organizations and members, greatly extending the reach of the coalition as a whole and allowing you to reach new stakeholders. This is incredibly important as we talk about building that table and building trust. So what are benefits to members? Creating new partnerships and improving trust through the coalition is a benefit already to the members. You're going to see this theme of trust building, obviously, is going to be threaded through. The partnerships, either through the work of the coalition itself or through other collaborative work that follows, can create opportunities for organizations to share resources, contacts, and skills, greatly improving one another's reach and capacity. In addition, participating in a prominent and successful coalition can increase brand recognition for the member organizations and individuals, establishing them as credible leaders in their field. So this is why form a coalition, the benefits both to the mission, what is your goal, and the benefit to the individual members or stakeholders, organizations. So I want to take a minute to talk about a case study, ground this idea of a coalition, particularly for those of you who have not participated or worked with a coalition in the past. Here we have a case study and we're looking at Thomas County, Kansas. The coalition in Thomas County initially was formed in 1998 with the goal of addressing alcoholism and drug abuse. The coalition included a broad range of members from the public and private sector, including local businesses, healthcare providers, schools, local library, the county health department, county chamber of commerce, among others. While the coalition started with the goal of addressing alcoholism and drug abuse, that is initially why they were established. After a decade, their role and mission evolved to reflect changing health concerns throughout the county. So this is really important that they were adaptable and they adjusted to what the priorities were. In this situation, when the Thomas County in 2012 identified this issue around child obesity, they found that in Thomas County, they had 30% of children designated obese, while nationwide it was 17%. So this was a huge health challenge for the county. And they decided as a coalition that they could play a role in addressing it. They looked closely at the data in the area, and they saw that physical inactivity was a huge contributor. And this is even though almost half of the children in the county lived within a 5-minute walk of school. But only 10% walked or cycled to get there, largely due to a lack of safe, well-maintained sidewalks and bike lanes. And because Thomas County Coalition already had such strong, long-standing partnerships between a broad range and array of organizations, they were well prepared to respond to this emerging health concern in the community and to take advantage of opportunities to promote health. So they recognized one such opportunity in 2015 when the city of Colby, which was part of the county, adopted its pedestrian and bicycle master plan. The Thomas County Coalition knew this plan would be critical to creating a healthier, more activity-friendly route or activity-friendly built environment. So they quickly launched an active transportation work group, or task force, if you want to call it that, within their existing coalition to look for ways to support Colby's master plan, including advocating for a formal complete streets policy. In addition, the Thomas County Coalition successfully led fundraising efforts to support 2.2-mile walking trail, along with improved sidewalks to provide safer routes for children to walk and bike to school. In total, the coalition helped communities in Northwest Kansas secure over $1.3 million in grants to support active living, as well as community engagement and healthy food access. They also coordinated events to encourage healthy living, such as walk at lunch day, for example. The coalition's strong, broad collaboration and engagement made a big difference in achieving their mission of a healthier Thomas County. The county improved from the 6th healthiest county in Kansas to the 2nd healthiest, in part thanks to the work of this coalition and their partners. And I would add, this really ties into having that shared vision. And the vision is something that we talked about in the last module. It was specifically Chris Zimmerman when he was talking about his work in Arlington, Virginia around one of the corridors there that he was instrumental in developing, changing the development and moving through that process in a way that really engaged the community. And fundamentally, as part of that process, they built a shared vision of what they wanted. So, and I think that ties obviously very clearly into the conversation that Christopher had with us, where he spoke about the importance of having that vision established and using that vision to develop the framework. So in this case, Thomas County Coalition established for a very specific purpose 10, 15 years before. They identify as a coalition a new sort of issue that they want to address. And because they had these strong partnerships, strong relationships, because they had a table they had already established and they had that trust, they were able to use that partnership in order to implement activity-friendly routes, in this case, specifically looking at schools. So this is a great example of what a coalition can do. So I just want to talk a little bit about forming a coalition to advance complete streets. And we're going to use an example that is close to our hearts at Smart Growth America, which is around forming the coalition of the National Complete Streets Coalition. So I'm going to take you through these 8 steps, and I'm going to try and be quick because we don't have too much time, and I want to leave a little time at the end for discussion and to hear a little bit about what coalitions are active in Charlotte right now, and thinking about strategizing how we can strengthen those coalitions, how we can build a larger table, and how we can make sure that it is built on a foundation of a shared vision and trust. So here are the 8 steps. Perform first. I won't read through them. I'm going to go through them so you can see we've got a very sort of systematic approach to how we will form a successful coalition. And the first step is to perform a stakeholder analysis. First, you need to identify your natural allies and the community that you're ultimately working to benefit. You know, who cares about this topic? Natural allies might involve individuals and organizations who are already vocal about the issues your coalition cares about. In the case of activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations, this might include organizations working on safe routes to schools. It could involve local walking and biking interest groups. Also consider the existing networks within the community you're trying to serve through your advocacy efforts. For example, are there active neighborhood or faith-based institutions that you can engage? You know, find out who cares about this topic. Data from your state, regional, or local transportation agency can help you identify these natural allies and community groups. In the case of health equity and transportation safety, for example, data can pinpoint the people and places most impacted by the problem you're trying to solve and who stand to benefit the most from your coalition's work. This map that you see in front of you, if you can't tell already, is New Orleans, the Crescent City, which I was a resident of for over 7 years, so it is dear to my heart. The map of the city of New Orleans shows that people are killed while walking or biking most often in certain areas, specific low-income areas, so a coalition there is working towards safe, activity-friendly routes, and in this case should partner with local residents and community groups representing these people and places. So next you need to think about who needs to be involved to create the changes you're trying to achieve. Who carries out this work on a day-to-day basis? Who makes decisions about how the work will be carried out? In the case of activity-friendly routes, this might include the city, county, regional, or state transportation and public health or public works departments, public transit providers, and elected officials. The United States Department of Transportation has identified 5 steps for how transportation projects are done. You want to think about what step you are trying to influence and who makes decisions around that step. This is a list of common agencies that work at the local, regional, and state levels and make transportation decisions accordingly. So finally, think creatively about other groups you can engage who share similar goals but who might not seem obvious at first. For example, consider engaging the private sector, including developers, as we heard at length about from Christopher, or chambers of commerce, as well as transportation providers in the private sector, such as bike share or ride share companies. You should also engage other groups that might be impacted by this work, such as the police department, youth groups, senior centers, and the local school district. Finally, don't forget about other potential allies who share similar interests, such as affordable housing advocates. So as I said before, we're going to run through looking at this framework and talking about coalitions, and we will use a case study of our own near and dear National Complete Streets Coalition. Long before the National Complete Streets Coalition grew into the organization it is today, it began as a task force of organizations coming together to create a new approach to funding and planning transportation that better accounts for the needs of people of all ages and abilities. Early members of the National Complete Streets Coalition included natural allies such as America Bikes, the League of American Bicyclists, and the American Public Transportation Association, all of whom advocate for investments in better bike facilities and public transit, as their names imply. The group also included professional associations and advocacy organizations representing people who make decisions about transportation planning and design on a day-to-day basis, such as the American Planning Association, the American Society of Landscape Architects, and the Association of Pedestrian and Bike Professionals. Finally, other powerful founding allies included the American Heart Association, who wanted to create built environments to support healthy and physical activity, and AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons, who wanted to create walkable places where older adults can age in place. Over time, the coalition has grown to include organizations that span from private design firms to the Washington State Department of Transportation. So we looked at our stakeholders, and now the second step of forming a coalition is to convene a meeting or gathering of potential members. This is the first kickoff meeting for your coalition, and it's a critical one to set the stage for the rest of your work moving forward. So convene a meeting of potential members. You want to begin that process of building trust. You want to identify shared values, shared vision, deciding how all of the members can most effectively work together. Ideally, this would take place in person. Obviously, in times of crisis, such as the one we are experiencing today, you would be a little bit more creative, consider using video conferencing or conference calls to include people in that way. You want to think about what will be convenient and accessible for the people that you want to reach. So as part of a successful coalition, you really have to identify an achievable goal for the coalition. You need to have that shared vision. It needs to be very clear. You may even begin working not just to identify an achievable goal, but to articulate exactly what you want and hope to achieve from your coalition. And then, of course, you need to determine whether you would be able to measure it. So probably some of you here have seen this. SMART, I'll go through it very quickly. Identify an achievable goal for the coalition. You want it to be SMART. And I will tell you that SMART means specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So to be SMART, specific means that your goal should be clearly defined, and clearly defined in the sense of what will be achieved and who will be involved in achieving it. It also needs to be measurable. That means the goal clearly states how much or how many of something will be achieved. Attainable is something that you can realistically achieve. Relevant is something that's consistent with who's involved and with the desires, the coalition members, and the community that the coalition is hoping to serve. And finally, it should be time-based. This means the goal specifies a deadline by which it will be achieved. So here's some examples of using SMART goals. You can increase bike lane use among people of color by 15% in a traditionally underserved community, or 1 day per month block off Main Street to cars to bring awareness to pedestrian safety. These are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So once you've more clearly articulated your goal, there's an opportunity to rally more partners behind your coalition. So once you've identified the goal, your SMART goal for the coalition, then you might want to return to your stakeholder analysis and see if there are more people that you can bring to the table. Consider revising that. Consider conducting another stakeholder analysis and identifying new partners. So in the case of the National Complete Streets Coalition, the goal that was established by the coalition was to pass a federal complete streets policy in the next federal transportation authorization bill to ensure that all roadways built with federal dollars are built to ensure the safety of all roadway users. So in this case, it was specific. All roadways built with federal dollars are built to ensure the safety of all roadway users. It was measurable because you would either pass or not pass a federal complete streets policy. Attainable because the coalition believed that it was a realistic goal to be able to pass a federal complete streets policy. It was relevant because it's the safety for all roadway users. So if you're thinking about the approach in this case for a federal transportation authorization bill, it's relevant in this case, or for the complete streets policy to be built into that bill. It's relevant in this case because it's for all users. And it was time bound. The goal of the coalition was to have that policy built into the next federal transportation authorization bill. So then after you have identified your goal, you have as many people who are invested at the table, then you're going to select your organizational structure. And this has a lot to do with sort of the basics of how to run your organization, your coalition. How often are you going to meet? How are you going to communicate? How often? Are you going to have subcommittees, working groups, task force? What does the membership structure look like? And what is your decision-making process? So in the case of the National Complete Streets Coalition, for example, and there are so many coalitions out there that you could draw from, and specifically, you know, thinking about how you design the structure of your coalition should be relevant to the people who are meeting and the goal that you have defined. So in the case of the Complete Streets Coalition, the steering committee meets remotely every quarter and convenes in person annually to guide the coalition's upcoming work. And the Complete Streets Coalition has task forces who work on specific initiatives that have been identified by the coalition and the steering committee, such as the federal advocacy or strategic planning. And in this case, there are also, you know, you have the different partner levels, so people can engage with the coalition in different ways. So that's just a little bit about organizational structure, and of course, there are lots of examples out there. So then, in order to, you've got the people at the table, you know what you're trying to get done. It's smart. It's a smart, achievable goal. And now you have a structure with which you can move that goal forward. So then the fifth step is to create a campaign plan with short and long-term actions and responsibilities. And this will guide your campaign activities, including which members are responsible for doing what and when. So to create a campaign plan, first you want to look at the conditions you're starting with and achieving your goal or vision, in this case, thinking about health equity, activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations. So your campaign plan should go into detail about what you're going to do to achieve your health equity goals, who is responsible for each step or action item, and who else they'll work with to achieve it, when each step will be started and completed, and specific logistics of where and how each step will take place. Finally, or not finally, but moving through it, you will identify resources. You need to be able to fund the process. So this is assessing the materials and capacity at the coalition's disposal and or identifying potential grants or funding sources to fund and support the campaign. So for example, you need to think about staff. If you have staff, is this going to be volunteer? You can think about staff capacity and how to fund that. You can think about your meeting and event space. Are you going to meet in a community center? Do you need an office? And then all of the sort of layers of office life, of supplies, software, data, depending on how you plan to achieve your goal. Are you going to be passing out flyers? Are you knocking door to door? Do you need a space where you can bring people in to have conversations? All of that needs to be considered as you're identifying what resources you will need. So in the case of the National Complete Streets Coalition, they relied a lot in the early years on word of mouth to start the Complete Streets movement. It drew heavily on the existing networks and skill sets of its founding members that you can see here, including connections to federal advocacy in order to work toward its goal of adopting a federal Complete Streets policy. So that was key in the process. The coalition operated as a campaign and made use of meeting space and staff time from its member organizations. It eventually grew into a more permanent program and was adopted by Smart Growth America, and now has a full-time staff dedicated to its operations, although the steering committee still plays a vital role in guiding the work. So then implementing the campaign plan. This is where you'll put your vision into practice. Depending on what your campaign plan actually says, this step is going to look very different from coalition to coalition. So we'll focus on a few helpful tips very quickly. Communicate, evaluate, celebrate. So this is very important. It leads back to the conversation that we were having earlier. We need to communicate between our members and also communicate to the broader public, elected officials, and any others who might be involved in us being able to achieve our goal. We want to be transparent, open communication so that people know what is going on and how they might contribute or get involved. And when it comes to evaluation, this is something that you should be doing throughout the process. And then an important step is celebrating. So, and this is particularly important when you have a very large goal, is to set milestones and celebrate along the way and not wait until you've achieved the one big overarching goal, for example, health equity in complete streets for everyone throughout the country. You might want to look at specific milestones that you can celebrate so that you can keep people energized and keep people focused on what you're doing. I'm just going to skip through these very quickly. It just shows how complete streets were adopted over time. But I just want to hit the last one and give a few minutes for wrap up, which is to assess the results and determine next steps. So assessing the results, did you achieve your SMART goal? No. How can you improve your approach? Yes. Congratulations. And in some cases, you could disband, or you can build off of that and think about if there's any other related goal that you would like to shift your coalition's focus to. And I'm gonna stop share at this time, just so that we have a few minutes. I would like to hear, and I haven't been able to see the chat box, but I'm catching up now. So it sounds like we've had some chat around the coalition of over 11 different local advocacy groups across the state. This is great. And existing coalitions will do well to promote civic sense and unity, uplift spirit in Charlotte. Excellent. Is there anything anybody would like to add? We've just got a couple more minutes. I know I ran through that, but I really felt like I wanted to make sure that Christopher had some good time to speak with you. And that's just a little sort of, again, we'll be sharing all of the presentations, PDF versions. So even though I ran through that very quickly through the framework on how to build, maintain a coalition, that'll be available to everybody. But I would like to just open it up for any questions if we have any. Otherwise, I will start wrapping up.
Emily, this is Meg from Sustain Charlotte. I just real quickly want to mention, well, first of all, thank you for that amazing presentation. It was a fantastic look into how coalitions can be built and function well to influence decision-making. I just wanted to share with everyone on the call that Sustain Charlotte, Charlotte East, North End Community Coalition, and West Boulevard Neighborhood Coalition are launching a transportation coalition. And I've pasted the mission of it in the chat box here and would love to talk to anybody who's on this call about how your neighborhood or organization can get involved. We really want to make our voices heard as our community plans transportation.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. And definitely, I think that, you know, this is an opportunity, since we have so many people from different organizations affiliated with different groups here on this call, you know, see this as an opportunity to make these connections. And this, again, you know, having a shared vision, you might be from a variety of different stakeholders, but if you see that complete streets or activity-friendly routes, equitable development, all of those pieces are important to whomever you represent, and whether it's just yourself, this is a great opportunity to make those connections. And that's great, Kenya. Love to see that you could represent Hidden Valley, your neighborhood. Excellent. Well, great. I am going to wrap us up because we've just got a few minutes. I want to thank everybody again for joining us. And Thursday, we will be meeting for our final session. We will start with a little summary of what we've gone over, what we've heard in the 3 prior modules. In module 4, we will be discussing implementing complete streets for complete communities. And we have worked with the team on the ground there to dive into a specific area in Charlotte that we will be looking at more closely as a case study. And as I said before, we will have Cole Sicaro, who you heard from on our first module, and also Eric Sundquist, who is the director of the State Smart Transportation Initiative. So we're excited to have both of them here with us on Thursday, where we will continue this conversation and wrap it up. That will be our final session, so please don't miss it. And we're looking forward to seeing everybody on Thursday.